Well, hi, welcome everybody. I'm Ian Scoble, Chairman of the Philosophy Department, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this guest presentation by Stephen Horwitz. Stephen Horwitz is the Charles A. Dana Professor of Economics at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. Completed his MA and PhD in economics at George Mason University, and his bachelor's degree is in both economics and philosophy from the University of Michigan. He's the author of two books, Micro Foundations and Macroeconomics, an Austrian Perspective, and Monetary Evolution, Free Banking and Economic Order. And he's written extensively on Austrian economics, Hayekian political economy, monetary theory and history, and macroeconomics. In addition to several dozen articles in numerous professional journals, he's also done internationally recognized public policy work on the role of the private sector during Hurricane Katrina for the Mercatus Center, where he's an affiliated senior scholar. He's the author of numerous op-eds, a frequent guest on TV and radio programs, particularly speaking on the Great Recession, which is his topic today, and monetary policy. His current research is on the economics and social theory of the family, and he's at work on a book on classical liberalism and the family. Dr. Horwitz also serves as the book review editor of the Review of Austrian Economics, and he's the co-editor of the book series Advances in Austrian Economics. He's a contributing editor at the Freeman magazine, and he has a weekly column at the Freeman Online, and contributes to two blogs, Coordination Problem and Bleeding Heart Libertarians. Dr. Horwitz is a past recipient of 3 fellowship research grants from the Earhart Foundation and has been a visiting scholar at the Social Philosophy and Policy Center at Bowling Green State University. He was awarded the Hayek Prize in 2010 by the Fund for the Study of Spontaneous Order for his work on the economics of the family, among other things. At St. Lawrence, he's been the recipient of the Frank Piskor Lectureship and the Calvin Keene Award, served as an associate dean of their first-year program for 6 years as well. He's a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, and he's spoken to audiences throughout the U.S., Canada, Europe, and South America. And he's also been active in mentoring for the student group, Students for Liberty. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Stephen Horwitz.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, folks. Thanks for sharing your lunchtime with me today. I'm really happy to be here. I'm glad I had a chance to come up. I've been on the road since last Thursday. I was out in California, and this is the third talk I've done here in the Northeast. So this is the last stop on my spring break tour, as I like to think of it. What I want to do this afternoon is talk to you about the Great Recession. As you can tell by my subtitle, and it wouldn't be an academic talk if we didn't have a subtitle, that this is not a failure of capitalism. Rather, this is a failure of government. And I hope to make the argument in the next 40 minutes or so that that's exactly what we've seen happen over the last decade to 12 years. What I want to do is first talk a little bit about what didn't cause the Great Recession, then talk about what did, and then talk a little bit about the reaction to the Great Recession, what has been the policy reaction, what have been the problems with that, talk about some things at the very end maybe we can do to help ourselves get out of this. And at the very end, my last slide, I have some sort of recommended reading, things you might want to look at for more information. So let's start with the following. When people talk about the Great Recession, we often hear people say, well, this happened because investors, or people more generally, but certainly investors, were really irrational, or all of a sudden people got very, very greedy. Okay? And I want to address those. Let me talk first about the irrationality point. And let me ask you to consider a hypothetical. Suppose while we're in here for the next hour and 15 minutes or so, everyone, of course, has their cell phones off or on vibrate. No one's looking at them, of course, while I'm talking. So as we discover that when we finish here in an hour and 15 minutes, that while we've been doing this, there were several hundred automobile accidents in downtown Boston. Okay? Now, we know it's a nice day outside, so it's not about snow or ice or anything like that. And if we started to think about this, what would we say? Right? What might have caused several hundred automobile accidents in one day? Did drivers just become irrational? Was there mass psychosis in downtown Boston? Right? Were people so upset about not winning the World Series that they just started crashing cars into each other? And it seems like those explanations aren't very satisfactory. And after a while, we were thinking about this. What might cause hundreds of automobile accidents in Boston in 2 hours? That's not a rhetorical question. That's a real question. What might cause it? What about the stoplights? They can fail. Okay, we have to be specific, though, because let's suppose they fail, they didn't work. If all the traffic lights turned off and you were driving in downtown Boston and you came to an intersection, what would you do? You'd stop. You'd be really cautious about proceeding through. And by the way, we know from Hurricane Katrina, when the lights did go out in New Orleans, that's exactly what drivers did. They treated those intersections as four-way stops. So it's not that the traffic lights stop working. What would be the really bad problem? Yeah, someone said it. Say it again. Yeah, if they all turn green. Right? Suppose they're all green both ways. If they're all green both ways, right, you see the green light, you think, go, and you go. Right? Of course, the cross traffic sees the green light. They think green, go, right? Boom, trouble. Because one of the things about traffic lights is it's not just that a green light means you can go. It implicitly means you can go and the other traffic has stopped, right? So when we see a green light, that's what we think. Oh, well, we can go because the other traffic has stopped. But if all the lights are green, right, everyone thinks the other traffic stopped and everybody goes and we get accidents. Now, if someone said, well, all those accidents happened because drivers were irrational, I don't think we'd want to say that. In fact, drivers were quite rational. All right? They were responding quite rationally to the signal they saw in front of them. Green means go, and the other traffic has stopped. You went. And in fact, what I'm going to argue today is that this is what happened in the build-up to the Great Recession, which is we didn't see people acting irrationally. What we saw were irrational, mistaken signals that led people to make mistakes, not because they were irrational, but because the signals they were relying on to make their choices were, in fact, irrational or mistaken. So just like all green traffic lights will lead to accidents, not because drivers are somehow irrational, but because the signals they rely on to be rational are misleading them. So it's not about, I'm going to argue it's not about irrationality. Okay? I'm also going to argue it's not about greed. As a colleague of mine has said, blaming recessions on greed is like blaming air crashes on gravity. Right? Gravity's always there. You can't blame gravity when a plane crashes, right? There's some other reason, right? Because planes fly with gravity all the time. Right? In the same way, when we look at economies, self-interest is always there. People are always behaving in some broad sense self-interestedly. I mean, either you've got to have a story about why people suddenly became greedy in the build-up to this Great Recession, or it has to be something other than greed that led people to do all the things they did from 2001 to 2007 or so. Because greed, self-interest, is always there. Right? And if you really believe greed's the problem, by the way, don't look for economists for answers to this. Go to the psychology department, right? But we know that again, this kind of behavior is omnipresent. All right? So it's not irrationality. It's not greed. Okay? Well, what is it? Well, we have to ask the question: what's the analogy for traffic signals? Right? What's the traffic signals of the economy? And the best answer to that question, I would argue, are interest rates. Interest rates are. I would note, by the way, all prices are like traffic signals, right? All prices in an economy guide people's behavior the way traffic signals do. But perhaps the most important price that guides the most traffic at the major intersections is the interest rate, or interest rates, plural. And modern economies are places in which two things are true. All exchange takes place through money, and all production takes place through time. Right? So when we trade with one another, we trade with money. Right? And all those exchanges, or nearly all those exchanges, take place using money of some form or another. We, as economists, say money is the medium of exchange. Right? Exchanges take place using money. But the other point is that time, that all production takes time. Right? You could sort of say time is the medium of production. All right? That it takes time to decide, to start a project and see it through to completion until the consumers actually can buy the good. So all exchange takes place through money. All production takes place through time. So time and money are really, really important for how economies function. And ideally, what we want in an economy is for people's preferences, consumers' preferences about time, to line up with producers' actions with respect to time. So what do I mean by that? Right? So if consumers, let's say, get more patient, consumers want to save more, right? They're saying, you know what? I don't need as much stuff now. I'm willing to wait to the future. If that's the case, then we would want producers to respond to that by taking their time, by investing in longer-term projects that pay off a little bit later in the future. Those projects, if you take more time, by the way, you can be more productive, you can get more stuff. And so if consumers are more willing to wait, producers ought to be building things that are sort of that much farther into the future. If consumers get impatient, that is, they want stuff now, producers should respond by shrinking the time their production processes take and moving relatively more towards the present. When producers and consumers are in step this way, right, that's what we call, here's your economics jargon for the day, we call that intertemporal coordination, right? The plans of producers through time are coordinated with the plans of consumers through time, right? Both groups are consistent with each other. Their plans, the word we sometimes use is, their plans dovetail, okay? So how do we ensure that? How do we make sure that those plans are consistent with each other? And the answer is interest rates, right? If the market is functioning properly, it's interest rates that signal to each party what to do. So for example, if consumers save more and put more money into the banking system, banks have more money to lend out, they can lower their interest rates and offer more loans. That's good. Why? Well, consumers are more patient, they're saving more. Producers now see lower interest rates. That signals to them that longer-term projects are worthwhile to undertake because it's cheaper to borrow for that longer period of time, and they, in fact, undertake the longer-term projects. Consumers get more impatient, they save less, interest rates rise, producers see it's more expensive to borrow, they borrow less, right? This works, except when we have a central bank trying to manipulate this process. What central banks are able to do, if they wish, is to make it look like people are saving more when they're really not. So when the Fed, from the Federal Reserve System, engages in expansionary monetary policy, when it increases the money supply, it does so by providing more funds to banks that they can make loans with. So banks have these funds that the Fed has in essence created out of nothing, right? Created by they used to say a stroke of the pen, now we'd say a click of the mouse, okay? Has brought these funds into existence by, in essence, writing an IOU off of itself. The banks have them, the banks can lend it out. And if the banks can lend it out, they'll lower their interest rates. And it looks like, to producers, that people are more patient. It looks like there's more savings. But in fact, there hasn't been. And so what happens is the producers start to engage in these longer-term projects, thinking there'll be more saving to finance it, and thinking that consumers want to wait. But consumers don't. Consumers still want stuff relatively more in the present. And so now you've got intertemporal discoordination. The plans of producers and consumers are not consistent with each other. To use a word very fashionable today, this situation is not sustainable, okay? You can't keep producing for the future when consumers don't want stuff that far in the future. Something's got to give here. The other analogy I like to use is, it's like, one's like building two railroads that don't meet, right? Or like pulling a piece of taffy at each end, right? Eventually it will break in the middle. And that's the problem you've got here when the central bank engages in this kind of expansionary monetary policy and manipulates the interest rate. And so what happens over time is, at first, producers start borrowing and things look great and they're building and we're investing in these long-term projects and the economy's booming. And then there comes a point at which they realize, wait a second, all this stuff we're creating, nobody's going to buy, or few people are going to buy, because they really didn't want to wait, they wanted stuff now. And when that moment happens, that's when we turn from boom into bust. So that's the story here, right? And this is why these traffic lights, the traffic light of the interest rate, is so important for coordinating people's plans over time. So what happened over the last few years? Well, since 2001, and here's your little bit of economic data for the day, okay? This is what we call the federal funds rate. And this is the interest rate that banks charge each other when banks lend money to each other. And this is one of the key rates that the Federal Reserve tries to target, okay? And if you look at the actual Fed funds rate, if you look here, do I have a little point? Yeah, well, yes, I do. If you look about 2001, right, just after 9/11, right, the federal funds rate dropped. It was below 2%. It stayed below 2% till about early 2005, and came back up. So that's about 3.5 years below 2%. That's historically low. That's a very, very low interest rate. And that's a pretty strong indication of expansionary policy. But it gets worse. This is what we call the real federal funds rate. And this is that same you just saw minus the rate of inflation. So this reflects the real cost of borrowing, all right? So it's the interest rate you pay, but minus the rate of inflation. Because if your dollars are getting, if the inflation rate's positive, your dollars are getting cheaper. That means when you pay them back later on, you're paying back in dollars that are worth a little less. What you might notice here is that over that same stretch, where'd my little pointer go? I lost it. Anyway, over that same stretch from about 2001 to late 2001 to early 2005, the real federal funds rate was below zero. Notice that. It was below zero. What does that mean? In essence, that means people were being paid to borrow. If you borrowed money, right, you were borrowing so cheap that by the time you paid it back, inflation had taken away more value from the money you were paying back than the interest you paid on the loan. So you were paying back in cheaper dollars than you borrowed, even considering the fact that you were paying interest on. It should not surprise us then that people went on a borrowing boom. It should not surprise us that people bought a lot of houses, right? Houses are very interest-sensitive investments. And so when interest rates are this low, lenders are saying, geez, we can give stuff away, and borrowers are saying, I'm happy to borrow, right, if rates are that low. Again, mortgage rates weren't quite as low as this, but you get a sense of just how low interest rates were, okay? And so what we saw happen from 2001 forward was this is what we call an economic boom, a false boom, an unsustainable boom, right? Because we made it look like people were really saving and really waiting for the future when in fact they weren't. And eventually something had to give, and eventually it did in 2006 and 2007. So in fact here, what drove this boom, the primary factor that drove this boom was cheap credit. And cheap credit created by the Federal Reserve being overly generous, by engaging in overly expansionary monetary policy. Okay? And one of the important points I want to make here, and I'm going to come back to later on, is that it is during this boom that we make all of the mistakes. So much of what happened in the first decade of this century, in retrospect, turns out to be a mistake, in the sense that we overinvested in housing, we overinvested in real estate and construction, right? We put too much money into the wrong things. At the time, it looked like the right thing to do. When the light's green, you go, okay? But we know after the fact that the traffic lights were broken. The traffic lights were all green, right? The signals facing producers and consumers were inconsistent with each other. And we eventually got a crash, both literally and metaphorically, okay? And so that's the key here, all right? But it's only part of the story, right? This is the beginning. Cheap credit's the beginning. The other question we have to answer is, again, why did it end up in the housing market, all right? Because in past booms, we haven't quite seen the housing market be so central. It's worth noting, by the way, in the 1920s, in the build-up to the Great Depression, similar kind of story, there was a real estate boom and so on, but not of the sort that we saw prior to this one. So why the housing market? The general answer to this question is that there were a whole bunch of government policies in place that made housing artificially attractive. The most important are the ones you might be most familiar with, and that's the secondary mortgage market and people like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It's important to understand that Fannie and Freddie are government-sponsored enterprises. These are not sort of your regular profit-seeking corporations, all right? These were created by government. They had special access to funds at the Treasury. There was an implicit promise of a bailout if they failed. As we have seen, that was the case. Okay? They were unique institutions, very politicized institutions. And because of that, they didn't have to play by quite the same profit and loss rules as other firms do. And Fannie and Freddie stood by ready to buy up almost any mortgage that other people were originating. So if you were a mortgage broker, you could create a really, give out a loan to a really shady borrower, but be pretty confident that if you did, Fannie or Freddie would buy it from you and put it into one of these mortgage-backed securities and then sell it back to another bank. So if you're a mortgage broker, you didn't care too much about who you were giving this mortgage to if you knew that Fannie and Freddie would buy it up. And Fannie and Freddie would buy it up because they didn't have to worry about how good this loan was, because they didn't face the same profit and loss incentives that regular firms do. So given their access to government funds, they were just buying it all up, while mortgage brokers didn't have to worry, for the most part, about how risky their loans were. And so we had a situation where mortgage brokers are giving away mortgages because they knew they could sell them off to Fannie and Freddie. In addition to Fannie and Freddie distorting this market and making that happen, we had a big push for affordable housing. And this goes back, I mean, long time, but certainly most recently to the Clinton administration, and then to Bush, and certainly continued on with Obama, okay? But at the time, Clinton and Bush were the key, those two administrations were the key here. The idea was we had to make housing more accessible to more people. What I find interesting about the idea of how important affordable housing is notice the contradiction, right? Politicians say, oh, we need to make housing more affordable. We need to make housing cheaper for more Americans. Then when housing prices actually fell, everyone said, oh my God, housing prices are falling. We can't have that happening. Wait a second, I thought you wanted affordable housing, right? No, not that. No. Somehow we want it affordable, but we also want to make sure everyone's home keeps the same value or increases. Well, how exactly, how exactly is that going to work, okay? So affordable housing was part of this too, and in particular, right, we had U.S. government, federal government policies targeting minority and poor borrowers, trying to encourage them to be, and ensure that they became homeowners. So for example, Countrywide Mortgage, based mostly in California, made a niche for themselves in the market by trying to expand homeownership among Hispanic families. And so they had very generous lending policies that tried to encourage Hispanic families to borrow. A lot of that was encouraged by various government policies. They were pressured by Congress to expand their lending to Hispanic borrowers. It's not coincidental that 3-4 of the states where three of the states anyway, where we saw the biggest drop in home values and the biggest housing market disaster were California, Nevada, and Florida. Okay? All of those have, certainly California and Florida in particular, have high Hispanic populations, and Countrywide was doing a lot of business there. So that's sort of one part of this story. Fannie and Freddie too had certain congressional mandates they had to meet. Fannie and Freddie were told by 2005 that 52% of their financing had to be to households with below median household incomes. So that's in the lowest 50% of household income in the United States. They had to be making half of their loans, or half of the mortgages they held, had to be to those households. And then later on, they were told also that those less than 60% of median household income, which is relatively low income now, right, they had to be making a substantial portion of their loans to those groups as well. So Fannie and Freddie were told by Congress, you need to make more loans to poorer families, all right? Well, again, we know poorer families are just going to be greater credit risks, and so they found all kinds of ways to come up with these new mortgage instruments that tried to do this. Turns out that wasn't such a good idea. The other thing people talk about a lot, I'm going to mention it, is the Community Reinvestment Act. I don't think this was all that important, though it played a role. The Community Reinvestment Act mandates that banks invest a certain percentage of their loans, including mortgage loans, in the local community. And this also was, the standards were upped on this in the 90s, and more banks had to make more loans to more poor families, again, by law, not because they thought they were good loans, but by law. And again, we might think it's a good thing to help more people own homes, but it really doesn't help them if you put them in homes they can't afford, and then they can't pay the mortgage back later on. That's not only will they not have a home, you'll have destroyed their credit in the process. A couple other things to mention here, too. There was a change in tax policy that ended the capital gains tax on home sales, so it made it more profitable for people to flip houses, right, to buy them and sell them. Now, again, in general, I think getting rid of taxes is a good thing, all right, but we shouldn't be surprised that when you lower taxes on one thing but not on others, that resources flow to the thing that has a lower tax rate. And so we saw this growth in the real estate market over this period. Again, adjustable rate mortgage and people flipping homes were part of this too, right? With all this activity and cheap loans and selling without the capital gains tax, we flipped that house became the national motto, okay? Another piece of this too is that there are these rating agencies who have to rate the securities that the mortgage-backed securities that people were selling. Those rating agencies, there's only 3 of them. It's different now. There were only 3 of them at the time who were allowed to officially rate securities for the purposes of these particular kinds of activities. 3 who were authorized by the Securities and Exchange Commission of the federal government to do so. They had what we would call an oligopoly, right? They were a cartel. And so there was no competition here, and what these guys ended up doing was kind of ending up in the pockets of the financial organizations who were issuing these securities. So instead of rating them to help consumers figure out what to buy, they were rating them to help producers sell them more easily. And that wasn't very useful. But again, there was nobody to step in and compete with them to say, hey, look, you're not doing it right. Okay? two last things. Tax law changes made it more profitable for banks to, instead of issuing a mortgage and holding it themselves, to take that mortgage, sell it to Fannie and Freddie, and then buy it back with 100 other ones as part of one of these mortgage-backed securities, one of these groupings of mortgages. If banks did that, they could buy back the very same mortgage in one of those mortgage-backed securities and hold only about 1/8 of the capital against it. So you originate a mortgage, you sell it to Fannie and Freddie, then you buy it back as part of one of these packages of mortgages, and you could, to use the language of economists, you could leverage up, right? You could have much less capital per dollar. And so banks love this, and so this is what they did. Not surprisingly, we got this huge market. And finally, what's known as the Greenspan put. It was just Greenspan said, the Federal Reserve cannot stop bubbles from happening, but we can cushion the blow when they burst. And so people said, okay, if that's what you're going to tell us, then we won't worry about bubbles, right? Because if you're going to cushion the blow when it bursts, you'll take care of us. And so part of this, people just kept, again, pushing this thing forward. So that's why the housing market. So what we had was a boom and then a bust that was the product of cheap credit from the Fed, plus these housing policies that steered that credit into the housing market and gave us all this stuff and all these crazy financial instruments that were built on top of it. It looked like housing prices would never come down. And so people said, let's work on the assumption housing prices will never come down. Well, guess what? They did, and we got the crash. By the way, deregulation was not the culprit here. Sometimes you hear people say that, and I can say more about this in the Q&A, but let me just quickly say right now that between 1980 and 2009, there were 4 new regulatory policies in the financial markets and financial systems for every one deregulatory policy. So if you look at the total amount of regulation of financial institutions, right, it grew significantly over this period. 4 new regulatory policies passed for each one deregulation. It's hard to argue that deregulation was the culprit here. Yes, there were new financial instruments that that the government hadn't quite figured out what to do with. But those instruments were created only because of the things we were just talking about, right? If we hadn't had the Fed doing what it was doing and we hadn't had the housing policies, we never would have had these weird, crazy instruments coming out in the first place. One other thing you can see here is that most of the these mortgage-backed securities were produced by the federal government, by Fannie and Freddie. Much fewer of them produced by the private sector. So again, if we're looking for who to blame here, our eyes should turn towards really bad policies. Again, cheap credit, bad housing policies, and things like Fannie and Freddie that made this happen. Okay, so that's how we got in this mess. Now, what do we do? There's a few broad lessons that we should think about as we think about how do we get out of this mess. And I've been giving this talk now, versions of it, right, for a few years. And now technically the recession's been over for quite a while, but we're in this, depends what you want to call it. But certainly I like to call it the barbecue economy, right? Low and slow, right? Low and slow growth rates, all right? 1%, right? Not going very far. Still positive, but not going very far. Why? Why can't we seem to generate a meaningful recovery? Compared to other recessions, we have not responded quickly the way we have in past recessions. So why not? A few things to think about. First of all, bailouts, stimuli are not the answer. Okay? Why aren't they the answer? First, what we need to do is let the economy heal. Okay? It's important to remember that we made the mistakes during the boom. Okay? What the recession is how we recover. We don't need a recovery plan. Recessions are the recovery. It's maybe strange to think about because recessions are not fun, right? People are unemployed. But once you've made the mistakes, right, you have to correct them. I'll use my favorite analogy, okay? Look, if you go out on Friday night and drink too much, right, you've put all this toxic alcohol, this is where it gets like a temperance lecture, you've put all this toxic alcohol in your body. You've poisoned yourself, believe it or not. Somehow, you got to get rid of it. You're going to feel awful the next morning, right? And when you wake up the next morning and you feel awful, you don't say to yourself, ooh, I must have done something really stupid this morning to feel so awful. What you should be saying to yourself is, I must have done something really stupid last night to make me feel so awful this morning. And you have to get through the hangover. So you got to wait till the toxin leaves your body, whichever way it might leave, okay? Same with economies, right? When you make mistakes, those mistakes have to be corrected. And recessions are the process by which we figure out what the mistakes are and begin to correct them, right? Which often means that the bad news is the good news. I like to tell the story. This was maybe 9 months into the recession. I was college hunting with my son. We were sitting in a hotel watching, I think it was Fox News, but it doesn't really matter, right? And the reporter was talking about how housing starts were down by 25%. And isn't this terrible? And I turned to my son and said, no, that's great, right? Housing starts should be down. We built too many damn houses, right? We need to correct those mistakes. So sometimes the bad news is the good news, right? When economies show signs that they're correcting the mistakes of the boom, we should be applauding that and allowing it to happen. And this is the problem with bailouts and the stimulus program, is that they tend to lock in the mistakes we made during the boom. If you bail out the housing industry and the construction industry, if you bail out GM and the banks, okay, not only can we talk about whether it's sort of just that we bail out people who made all these mistakes, just from a practical economic standpoint, you're rewarding the institutions that made the mistakes. You're locking in the very things we did wrong for a decade that we want to stop doing. And one of the key things that market economies are good at is helping us learn from our mistakes if government doesn't get in the way. And when government gets in the way, it prevents us from learning from our mistakes. We keep touching that hot stove with our hand, right? If we don't get the chance to learn that it burns. And that's the key here, okay? Another thing to consider is that experimentation is not a good strategy. Trying one policy, then another, and flip-flopping around from policy to policy is not a very good way to handle recovery. There's a bunch of reasons for this. Most of them, however, sort of go back to things that we know from the Great Depression. One of the things that some scholars argue about the Great Depression is that Hoover and Roosevelt both engaged in all of these different policies, sort of trying one thing, then trying another, and moving around, and particularly policies that were very much sort of anti-business policies. The result of those policies was that in private sector investors didn't know what to expect next. And the policies created what we now call regime uncertainty. That is, uncertainty about what the rules of the game are, uncertainty about what the next policy is going to be. And again, some scholars of the Great Depression argue that in the 1930s, that's the key factor that extended the Great Depression as far as it went. And we don't want to make that mistake, and we might be making it right now, right? What we need is clarity, right? We need some kind of clarity about what the rules are, what the regulations are, about what the future holds. And if we keep trying this or trying that or bailing out this, then not bailing out that, even the decisions to bail out some investment banks and not others created enormous uncertainty. And if it's one thing the private sector hates, it's uncertainty. You can't ever get rid of it, but you can reduce it. Okay? And again, healthcare reform might be an example of this. Whatever you think of healthcare reform in and of itself, it's created significant uncertainty for the private sector. They don't know what the real cost of hiring someone is going to be, so they're hesitant to hire. If they hire, they're committing to this person. When healthcare reform really kicks in, what's this going to cost me? Nobody knows, and so they're saying, let's wait. Maybe healthcare reform will get repealed. Maybe it'll become clearer what the real costs are. Right? Again, you can come up with other examples of this as well, but I think that's a useful one. Finally, crises are never temporary. The history of the United States is littered with examples of where we had a crisis like the one we had. And people thought, well, look, we'll adopt these kind of policies to deal with the crisis, and when the crisis is over, we'll get rid of those policies and we'll go back to normal. Never works. Everything, not everything, much of what gets done in a crisis often sticks around. Crises are never temporary. Anyone know what year Fannie Mae was created? Answer, 1938, right in the middle of the Great Depression. Well, we need a policy to deal with the housing problems during the Great Depression. We'll create these government-sponsored enterprises. Guess what? 75 years later, almost, still with us. Great Depression did end, if I recall, at some point. Okay? Even the policies that enabled the Fed to expand the money supply the way it did, going off the gold standard and the Banking Act of 1935, which gave the Fed certain powers. Again, products of the Great Depression. So crises are never temporary. Whatever we do in response to the Great Recession is likely going to stick with us. And this is important because oftentimes crises are an opportunity for people who have long wanted to do certain kinds of things, fundamentally reform, let's say, the economy. This creates an opportunity for them to do so, regardless of whether those reforms have anything to do with actually recovering from the crisis. So when when the Roosevelt administration came into power, right, they passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Industrial Recovery Act, which we now think of as being, oh, that was the New Deal, sort of part of recovering from the Great Depression. But at the time, that's not what that was about. Folks at the time saw those as being fundamental reforms of the capitalist economy that they thought were necessary anyway, regardless of the Depression. And so I mean, healthcare reform might be another example of this as well. Other things, crises are an opportunity to do things that you might not otherwise be able to do that might have very little to do with actual recovery. So we might ask, has the recovery plan, particularly the stimulus back in 2009, has it been a success? And I will note, this is my very favorite graph in my whole presentation. All right. Let me explain to you what this is. It looks like a mess. The dark blue line you see, the curvy dark blue line, is what the Obama administration said the unemployment rate would be over the next few years if we passed the stimulus. The kind of light blue gray line above it is what they said the unemployment rate would be if we did nothing. That is, if we didn't pass anything. Okay? The red dots all the way at the top, that's the actual unemployment rate. Right? And you'll notice, for example, there it is. Probably can't see, there's my red. That's the December 2011 unemployment rate, about 8.5%. And this is where they said we'd be with the stimulus. This is where they said we'd be without the stimulus. And we're way up here. Okay? They got it wrong, is a nice way of putting this. Okay? Not only did they get it wrong, it seems plausible to argue that the stimulus might have made matters worse. Now, of course, they might have been wrong in their assumptions and all that. But the fact that we're worse off, they told us if we didn't do anything, here's where we'd be, right? And by now, we'd have an unemployment rate of about 6.5%. Meanwhile, we're at 8.5%. Right? We did worse than what they told us would happen if we did nothing. Now, critics will say, well, that's because the stimulus wasn't big enough. Okay, I mean, I can't prove that to you. It's at least possible, right? But how much is enough, right? I mean, it seems, if you take the rest of my argument, it seems reasonable perhaps to conclude that had we done nothing and let the economy actually begin the healing process, some of which I think we're starting to see right now, okay, we might well have been, by having done nothing, certainly lower rates of unemployment, okay? So it's hard to argue that the recovery plan, the stimulus, has been a success, at least judging by the unemployment rate, which has been persistently and consistently higher than even the administration itself thought it would be if we had done nothing. The other thing I'll mention real quick is monetary policy. There was a pretty good debate about what the Fed should have done in September of 2008. Even among sort of, free market type economists, there was a healthy debate about what the Fed should do, okay? Some said it should do nothing. Others said, no, central banks the Fed should follow the rule that central banks historically have been told to follow in a crisis, which is you lend as much as possible to healthy banks at a penalty interest rate. What you don't do is lend money to failing banks. You lend money to the good banks to keep them healthy, but you make them pay a little higher interest rate so they don't borrow too much. That's been the standard rule, okay? But nobody wanted what happened. And what happened is this. This is what we call the monetary base, which is essentially the sum of all the currency in the U.S. economy plus all of the reserves, all the deposits that banks have at the Fed. This is all of the money that the Federal Reserve System creates itself. So this is not your checking account dollars. This is currency plus the money that the banks have deposited at the Fed, on credit at the Fed. You can see what happened here, right? It's a hockey stick, okay? In the fall of 2008, right, this thing just started going up like a rocket, okay, and continues to go up like a rocket. This is now at about $2.7 trillion, right? It started at about 900 trillion. The monetary base has tripled in the last 3 years. Less than 3 years, no, 3 years. Tripled. Okay? Nobody thinks this is a good idea. I don't know. I mean, maybe Bernanke does. But most people do not think this is a good idea. And there's, of course, a huge danger here, a huge danger of inflation. And the Fed has taken on new powers that it never had before. By the way, the Fed did not ask Congress for these powers. It just took them. It's a good example of how crises can produce these permanent changes. I don't think the Fed will ever give these powers away. But the Fed now the reason this has gone up so much is the Fed has bought all of these junky mortgages and mortgage-backed securities off of banks' balance sheets that it now owns, and it pays for them by giving them credit at the Fed, which is part of the monetary base. Thankfully, all that stuff is sitting in those accounts. The banks haven't lent them out yet. But if the banks do lend them out, the danger of very severe inflation will be a real one. And whether the banks lend them out and how the Fed might bring that base back down is no one has, and we don't know if when the banks might start lending it out, and can the Fed bring that back down? No one has given, I think, a really good answer to that question, how the Fed might do that. And so one of the real concerns people have in the medium term is the potential of significant inflation because of the way we responded to this. So all right, so that's the depressing part. Is there anything we can do? All right. I think there's a few things we can do, and I'm going to divide them into the short run and the long run. Clearly, unemployment remains a big problem. So if one of the things we want to do to address unemployment, one of the things we can do to address unemployment is to suspend the payroll tax. Now, what's happened is that we've suspended the payroll tax, or at least reduced the payroll tax that employees pay, right? We got that little tax cut recently on the employee side. But the more radical solution is to suspend it totally on the employer side, right? Reduce the cost to employers of hiring people by suspending that payroll tax, even if it was temporary for a year or two, right, to encourage firms to hire. That's one thing we could be doing, right, to encourage more hiring. A second thing we could be doing is similarly to suspend or reduce the capital gains tax, and I would argue the corporate income tax too I might put on there, right, would do similar good on the investment side. That would, even though investors remain uncertain, at least that would reduce some of the costs of investing, the taxes from the income on investments. That would help too, okay? So in the short run, those are certainly two things we could do. We could also, again, sell off the government stakes in General Motors and the banks and these other places and stop bashing legitimate profit-seeking in the financial markets. One of the mistakes of the Great Depression was that Roosevelt in 1936 ran on a highly anti-business platform. This is his famous speeches about the economic royalists ruining the economy, right? And that was very damaging as, again, private investors said, he's out to get us. The hell with it. We're not going to play this game, okay? We're not going to invest our money. And if we keep politicians of both parties keep bashing legitimate profit-seeking, that's a real danger, right? The other thing we can do is, again, find regulations where we can reduce regulations and reduce the uncertainty associated with them. I'm not going to be, what the specifics are not so much important as it's finding ways to make it easier for businesses to hire and easier for them to figure out what's going to happen in the future. What can we do in the long run? Well, for me, one of the key issues in the long run is we have to deal with the Fed. We need to remove those new powers that the Fed has, and we have to think about how we restrict its powers more significantly than that, including considering alternatives to central banking. As long as we have a central bank, we will always face the potential danger of the temptation faced by that central bank of wanting to expand the money supply too much will always be there, and we'll always face the danger of the all-green traffic lights, right, of interest rates being manipulated by the central bank. So that's a conversation we, as a polity need to have. Right? We might also consider stronger thresholds for major fiscal policy decisions, whether that's supermajorities, 2/3 or 3/4 majority, waiting times, a balanced budget amendment, whatever it is. I didn't talk about it, but it obviously goes without saying that the deficit and debt problem is equally out of control, $15 trillion of accumulated debt right now. Okay? And that's something we need to get under control. And how do we tie the hands of politicians? Because they, too, have an enormous incentive to continue to expand spending. Okay? And we need to get government out of the subsidy business. All right? Whatever it is, whether it's housing policy, agriculture, green jobs, Solyndra, whatever, okay? Stop it. All right? Stop preventing people from learning when they've made mistakes. One of the most important things markets do is markets are knowledge communication processes. They're learning processes. They're how we figure out what to do and what not to do. Free enterprise is a profit and loss system. Firms who make losses need to suffer, right? Think about your children. I hate think about the children, but think about your children for a second. If you bail your kids out of every mistake they ever make, you can bet they're going to make more mistakes, right? Same thing in markets. If we keep bailing firms out, they have no reason to use resources wisely. And if nothing else, we need to get the government out of the subsidy business. So those are some longer run, I think, things that we can do. that will both help the current situation, but I think more importantly, help us prevent repeats in the future. If we don't learn the lessons of this time around, it will repeat itself. We didn't learn the right lessons out of the Great Depression, right? And that's one of the reasons why we botched the response to this thing, because we had a story about the Great Depression we thought was the case, and I don't think it's the right story, right? But by following that mistaken story, we wound up messing up this one too. So if we want to get it right and not have another repeat of either the Great Depression or Great Recession, we need to learn these lessons and get it right. So here's some more things for you to look at. The graphics, the nice color graphics in this are taken from a short piece that I wrote with a colleague called The House That Uncle Sam Built. You can find it there. If you Google the phrase, the house that Uncle Sam built, you will find the PDF of that online. You can also follow, as Ian mentioned in his introduction, I blog at Coordination Problem. But there's some other recommendations for things to read. Engineering the Financial Crisis is a relatively new book by Jeffrey Friedman and Vladimir Krauss. That's outstanding. You should read that. Norberg's Financial Fiasco, published by the Cato Institute, is excellent too. My friend and colleague Robert Higgs blogs at that blog and writes terrific stuff on the recession. Any of those are good things. I'm happy to point you to more. The last thing I will add is, assuming that you're all on Facebook, feel free to look for me on Facebook and friend me. I post a lot of stuff on Facebook. Some of it doesn't even have anything to do with economics. I post a lot of stuff on Facebook with useful links and things like that, so feel free to add me as a friend. My only request is that when you do, send me a note that says you were at the talk at Bridgewater, because as my daughter would say, I don't want to think you're creeping on me. So just send me a little note, okay? So thank you all very much.